Blog Talk Radio.
Following ingredients include a look behind the scenes. Cook uncovered until hot. Add grooves to taste.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl.
The accident was over a year ago. A second woman has been elected president. A 12th planet has been named in the solar system. The last wild polar bear has died. I slept through it all. I was here for my waking. He called it a beginning. He said it was good. I think he may have thought that anything I did was good.
Welcome to Transition Radio, live from Hollywood, Florida, with your host and hostess, Mark Angelo and Jessica Lynn Cummings. Show for trans folks, by trans folks, here to let your voice be heard. Well, hello, and welcome to another edition of Transition Radio. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for everyone who's joining us on the chat room. We have lots and lots of chatters in the chat room. And tonight we have an amazing show with Lisa Salazar. But before we start our show, we want to thank our sponsor,
thebreastformstore.com. They have everything you need for your cross-dressing or transgender needs. Visit their website and tell them Transition Radio sent you.
On tonight's show, we want to touch on a subject that has stirred much emotions in the LGBTQ community, specifically faith in the trans community. Tonight's guest, Lisa Salazar, is an evangelical Christian who has battled with her gender dysphoria and how it fits in with her beliefs. Lisa was born in Colombia, grew up in California, and moved to Vancouver, BC in the early 1970s to start a successful career as a graphic designer and a photographer. After living for 25 years as a devoted husband and father, Lisa was diagnosed with gender dysphoria. She says this diagnosis was both a blessing and a curse.
Though it offered an explanation for her years of struggle, confusion, and guilt, it did not offer any simple solutions. It would take another 10 years before she could come to terms with the diagnosis. Lisa has written her autobiography, Transparently, Behind the Scenes of a Good Life, which is available on Amazon. She has given sensitivity workshops at Gay Christian Network, companies, high schools, and churches, and hopes to do more in the future. So let's give a warm welcome to the lovely Lisa Salazar.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, we're great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, good.
So how's it going? How's the weather in Vancouver?
Well, today it was sunny off and on. Right now it's a little cloudy. We've had a lot of fog the last few days. It's going to start raining again, but the temperatures have been pretty cool. Today seems probably not as cold as it's been, but anyway, it's gray. That's all I can say. It's gray. I miss the sunshine.
Yes, I know. We are getting a little bit of a cold air tonight. It's off and on, a little rainy, but yeah, that's the weather in the world for you.
Yes, it is.
So we're very glad to have you on the show. We've set up some questions, and I think tonight's show is going to be a very interesting show for a lot of individuals who have faced this battle between their faith and being transgender. So here's question number one. I believe nature has much variety. As part of nature, a two-spirit species has come to claim their place here on Earth. Why do you believe this condition, gender dysphoria, exists, and how does it fit in with your religious beliefs?
Okay, well, that's a good question to start with. The whole idea of being two-spirited, I mean, that's something that I have to admit I had never really heard of it until a couple of years ago after I transitioned. We have a lot of In Canada, we call them First Nations people. I know in the States it's Native Americans. In other parts of the world they're Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples. And the concept of two-spirited, being two-spirited, is something that I sort of understand conceptually. The fact that the word transgender, as you know, is a relatively new term. It was born sort of in the mid '80s. I think it was Virginia Price who first coined it. But that word, the idea of people who have a disconnection between their birth sex or natal sex and their gender identity, which is kind of like the wiring in the brain. I mean, that's been around forever, and in other cultures and other times, I know that we've been considered, special in many ways, spiritually, seen as spiritually sensitive and all that. We've, a lot of medicine men, shamans, witch doctors, priests, and whatever might have been transgender, what we now refer to as transgender. But you asked the question, why does this happen? And because it's true that in nature there's a lot of diversity and variety. Why does this gender dysphoria happen? Well, gender dysphoria is an interesting combination of words. It was my psychiatrist at the gender clinic who explained what dysphoria meant. He said, "Do you know what euphoria is?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." He said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, euphoria, you're exceedingly happy, you're joyous, exuberant, it's everything, it's just ecstasy." And he said, "Okay, dysphoria is the direct opposite of that. So someone with gender dysphoria is sad about their gender, is depressed about their gender. It's a complete opposite of being happy about your gender." So, really gender dysphoria is kind of, in my mind, this is my way of thinking, it's not an appropriate description of a condition. It's more better to say if you have gender dysphoria, that's a symptom. It's a sign that something is out of line in your person between your gender and your sex. So, what was the other part of the question you asked?
I actually asked that why do you think it exists, and how does it fit in with your religious beliefs?
Okay, and that's a loaded question because it didn't fit with my religious beliefs. I was brought up Catholic. When I was 17, I sort of stopped going to church, to Mass, as it's called, and because it just church or religion and my experience of it was not answering the most basics of questions that I had. Of course, my gender confusion, for which I had no language for, and like I said, the word transgender didn't exist, and every bit of research I ever did just left me traumatized. You look up the word transvestite in those days, and the textbooks talked about that this was a perversion, that this was something that the people who did it for sexual gratification, and that cross-dress and wore clothes of the opposite sex, it was all for sexual gratification. Well, I didn't relate to that because that wasn't my experience, nor did I particularly like what they recommended as treatment. They talked about castration, they talked about electroshock therapy, and they talked about lobotomies. And it was just horrific. It was draconian. So I had no in my faith or in my spiritual walk or journey, if you want to call it that. I didn't know what to make of it, and that was all part of my the challenge for me. In college and university. I was in university where I first came to a much deeper faith as a Christian, and it was largely through I don't know if you were around at that time, but I'm sure a lot of people will remember the Jesus People days in the early 70s, and that's when I sort of came into a deeper faith. But I came into a deeper faith, I guess, with an agenda or with an expectation. I thought that if I gave my life to Jesus, that I was going to be healed and I was going to be made normal, and that I just had to give it time, and I had to pray, and I had to have strong faith, and I had to do all these things. in order to line up all my ducks so that my prayers would be answered. So it became a spiritual battlefield for me. That's how I saw it. It was a spiritual war, and Satan was attacking me by making me feel inadequate as a man. I just wanted to be normal, period.
Right.
And what is
Exactly. Well, you do a lot of educating in the Christian community, and have you had a lot of opposition from the community towards the education of trans issues, or have you had a good reception?
Okay. Well, I like the way you put that question, that you said the Christian community rather than the church. The church, when I came out, it was just 5 years ago. I was already 58 years old. It took me a long time to come out and to, and part of it is that it took me a long time to reconcile my faith to the diagnosis. I was diagnosed at the gender clinic back in 1999 here in Vancouver, and I walked out of that clinic thinking there's no way I can do this. There's no way I can accept what the doctors are telling me because it seems to be contrary to everything I read in the Bible. Because Mark, what, as I said before, I mean, I spiritualized this whole thing, and so I memorized scripture. I read the Bible, and I used the Bible as a sledgehammer to smack down the whack-a-mole every time it came up, and I read over and over again. The one that I used the most, totally out of context, was the phrase "God created this male and female." And so there was no, in my mind, no allowance for the fact that there could be something else. And it took a long time for me to be able to finally look at Scripture, read it in context, and start to glean some insights. And it's kind of like the scales fell off my eyes, and I finally began to see things much differently. And it finally gave me the permission 5 years ago to start the process, and I began by first disclosing to my pastor. So in my community, and again to differentiate from church, because church, there is the church hierarchy, and there's denominations and all this kind of stuff, and they have doctrines and statements of faith, and they're very specific, they're very black and white. But then the community, what I like to think of as the people, there's sometimes a huge gulf between what the church doctrine and dogma says versus what people feel in their hearts. And so I think in my community, people were feeling with their heart. They were looking at me and saying, well, you've been around this for 15 years. We know your heart. We know what kind of person you are. We don't understand this, but you're going to help us understand, and we love you and we support you in anything we can do. So it was a very affirming community or church that I attended. Having said that, there were also people in that community that I knew were going to have a huge problem trying to reconcile me as a woman when they've known me as a man. How are they going to explain it to their children and all that kind of stuff? So for that reason, I chose, not because I was told, I chose to step aside when I transitioned and not to impose myself, not to foist myself and force the issue. I didn't want to become the elephant in the room, nor did I want to become the poster child for transgender issues in my church. And I think a lot of my friends understood my reason for stepping aside. I resigned as a worship leader. I was one of the rotating worship leaders at the church. I was very involved, and so my community was very supportive, and my friends. My youngest son just got married December 29th in that community and in that church.
This is the next question. How has your family adapted to the change you brought upon them through your transition, and has anything changed in your family dynamics since you were talking about your son? So.
Yeah, well, my family, one of the things that makes us human is that we have this frontal lobe that scientists say that's what we imagine with. That is our processing center. Emotional processing center is what we it's kind of like our simulator. So we kind of take in input and we sort of try to imagine how things are going to work out. And Mark, from all the evidence, all the little comments that I'd heard friends and family say over the years that were transphobic or homophobic, I had imagined the worst in every situation. I imagined the worst with my family, my parents being very devout Catholics and coming from South America, very Latin and traditional as far as family values. I imagined the worst. I thought my dad was going to disown me, call me all kinds of things, and basically say, "You're not my son anymore." I thought my mom was going to start pounding her chest, saying, "What have I done wrong? It's all my fault." The guilt thing, and it didn't happen like that. My dad was 91 when I came out to him. My mom was 85, and we were crying, of course. And the first thing out of my mom's mouth was, "What really hurts me is that I didn't know that you were struggling like this all your life." He said, "That really breaks my heart that I had no idea." And my dad says, "I'm so proud of you that you have survived this long and that you've tried to be a man and that you've worked, that you've your strength. I just admire your courage." That's not what I expected my parents to say. I expected the complete opposite. So beginning with my parents and with my sons, which I told them, this all happened in the course of 1 week back in 2008. I told my parents, and then I told my 3 sons, each personally and individually, and their response was also very loving, and I know that for them, as for my parents and my siblings and my ex-wife, and we are divorced, unfortunately. As a family, everybody has had to reimagine what the future is going to look like. What's this going to look like going forward? How are the grandchildren going to be told about grandfather? And what do we call this person? My sons call me Dad, and I'm okay with that. They introduced me to their friends as, "This is my dad, Lisa," which is, the first time I heard one of my sons introduce me to one of his friends that way, I was kind of taken aback. And then I thought, wow, he said this without any self-conscious, he was totally happy to introduce me, proud to introduce me, and that meant the world to me. The fact that my sons were able to embrace me in that way, it was just an amazing thing. And I send my emails to them as Dad. The cards that I send them is Dad. They call me Dad all the time, and I'm okay with that. I'm not going to deny the fact that I am their father. And we have a wonderful relationship. My parents call me their daughter now, which is an amazing thing. For them being the age they are, I can probably count in one hand the number of times that they have screwed up and called me by my original name or messed up the gender pronoun. They have completely surprised me in how well they were able to kind of just accept this new reality, this new normal.
Right, exactly. Well, in your bio, you stated that this whole thing has been both a curse and a blessing to have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Can you tell everybody why that is?
Oh, yeah. When I was diagnosed back in, I went through a 6-month assessment period. And at the end of it, I sat down with the psychiatrist, and he says, "Well, this is what you have. You have acute gender dysphoria. Here's how we can help you." They have the Harry Benjamin standards of care, the roadmap, as it were, all detailed. This is how we can help you. These are all decisions that you need to make, but we're here to help you. There's some protocols that we follow. We need to supervise you medically because when we start you on hormones, we have to make sure that your kidneys and your liver are not going to go into distress. We need to be doing blood work on a regular basis. We need to do a physical, all that kind of stuff. And sign here if you want to get started. And I remember looking at the doctor and saying, "There's just no way. There's no way I can do this." The very first thing on the list in those days was you have to start living full-time as a female. Well, heck, I had so many, I had never really even gone out in public as a woman, let alone have an appropriate wardrobe, or I'd never even attempted to completely, present as a female. So for me to now start living my life in public was just not going to happen. My sons were still at home; they were in high school. There was no way I could do that to them. There was just everything seemed to be a deal breaker. Everything on that list, and I just remember saying, "No, I can't do this. I just want you to give me a pill to numb this. I just don't. I just want to be normal." And I knew the answer. I knew what he was going to say. That doesn't happen. So that's the curse part of it, is that I immediately realized I wasn't prepared to pay the price socially. I wasn't prepared to put my family through it, nor did I have the money to begin the process. Yes, in Canada we have the medical services plan that does cover a portion of it. It does cover the gender reassignment surgery, but everything else, electrolysis, if you decide to have breast augmentation or facial feminization or hair transplant or anything else that you might need to do in order to better have that sense of congruence that you so desperately want, that's a lot of money. So I remember saying, no, I can't do this. And I walked away.
That deterred me from transitioning when I was 18 or 19 years old as well. Same thing.
So that was the curse. Now, the blessing side of it was that finally I had an explanation for this thing that had haunted me all my life, for this, what I called this demon. It wasn't a demon. This is a reality. It finally gave me an explanation that this is something that I didn't choose for myself. This is just who I was. But even though it sounded good to my ears, that was the problem with it. I had spiritualized it, and as a Christian, there is a passage that says that in the last days, men will do all kinds of horrible things, and they'll want to fill their ears with things that tickle their ears. They'll want to hear things that give them permission to do all these crazy things. And that's how I interpreted this. I thought, yes, this sounds good to my ears, but is this really what God has for me? Is this really what God wants for me? And I hadn't resolved that yet. It would take another 8 years before I finally began to see between the lines in Scripture.
Well, I'm not religious, and I respect everyone's belief. I'm very spiritual and believe that there was a man who walked this earth named Jesus, who came to open up our hearts and change the way the religious fellows were running the show. He taught us about unconditional love and never judge. Having battled with being a Christian and being transgender, and were you pushed aside, or did they understand and embrace you?
Well, I think I've talked a little bit about that already, but you talked about Jesus, and it was actually his words that kind of opened the door for me. It's interesting that it was the Pharisees who came to question him. The Pharisees had, this may sound simplistic, but they had developed so many rules for living. Everything had to be, you had to do this at a certain time. A lot of things were black and white. And they had these huge lists of how you should live your life. They added that they just kept adding and adding, making it really difficult for people to live to those expectations. Okay, so they come to Jesus and they ask him, Moses gave us permission to divorce our wives under certain conditions. What have you got to say? And they wanted to know, because in those days women were, of course, they didn't have toasters, but as an example, just to be ridiculous, you could divorce your wife if she burnt your toast every morning. You could issue her a certificate of divorce and send her on her way and marry another woman. So Jesus quotes from Genesis, and he quotes that passage, that famous passage in the beginning. You've read that in the beginning God created the male and female, and for that reason a man shall leave his father and mother and join and cling to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And what God has joined, let no one separate. Those very famous words that are often read in wedding ceremonies. And if you've never been to church, I'm sure you've seen it in a movie somewhere or on a television show when they show a wedding. But that's the passage that I took out of context. I took that phrase out of context, that God created this male and female. I didn't read any farther than that. Now, what's interesting is if you read a little farther, Jesus interjects into the conversation. Okay, the Pharisees, Jesus answers the Pharisees, they go away, but the disciples are struggling with what Jesus has said to them. And Jesus adds to their confusion by saying, I'm going to tell you something that not everybody will be able to understand or accept. There are some people that are born as eunuchs from their mother's womb, and yet there are others who are made eunuchs by men, and others who choose to be eunuchs for the kingdom of God. If you understand this, then accept it. Okay, reading that on face value seems so out of whack with what the discussion that preceded it, because he's been talking about marriage, he's been talking about divorce, he's been talking about fidelity and commitment, and suddenly he introduces this discussion about eunuchs in the same conversation. And Mark, that's where I began to see things. I began to understand things in a much different light, because if he is including this in the context of marriage and commitment and fidelity and loyalty to another person, well, he kind of and if he is God, as I believe he is, if he was God made man, then here's God himself declaring an enormous truth. He's saying in the beginning it was male and female, but it doesn't work that way anymore. The fact is that there are people who are born somewhere in the middle with ambiguous genitalia, more in some cases, and as we know, there's some who are born more male than female, and others who are born more female than male. There's some who are born right smack in the middle, and so that began to give me kind of the ability to envision that God was not going to judge me, and that he did not declare me as an abomination, because I never felt happy in my body since I was a little kid. Some of the earliest memories I had this connection between my body and how I felt inside. I wasn't smart enough to say, I think I'm a girl, but I just knew there was something that was off kilter, and it took me a lifetime to figure it out. And the information wasn't around when I needed it, and thanks to the internet in the 80s and 90s, I began to see, wow, there's other people like me, and began to educate myself.
We're down to almost 3 minutes, so we want to go ahead and ask the last question here.
Sure.
Tell everyone a little bit about your book, Transparently, Behind the Scenes of a Good Life, and how did it come about, and give everyone a quick synopsis of that.
Okay, very quick synopsis. The book came about in the 2 weeks preceding my surgery in 2010. I had been engaged in a series of emails with a friend from high school who had a lot of questions. She wanted to know why my family left Colombia, what my dad did in Colombia, what he did in the United States, why did we leave, all this kind of stuff. But she also wanted to know about me and my siblings, and when did you first realize that you were at odds with your gender, with your sex? And after about 6 emails, and I started to dread her emails, because they were just loaded with more questions. And I quipped to her, I said, Jan, if you keep this up, I'm going to have a book written before I know it. And she said, well, that's what I keep writing. This is so fascinating how you're a storyteller. I'm fascinated about your life, about your family, and I see a parallel here that you didn't have the language. You didn't speak a word of English when you arrived in the United States. You had to learn a whole new language and a whole new way of living and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of like there's a parallel there with your gender identity. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting perspective or way of looking at it. But something had happened during those emails. Mark, I had never kept a diary or a journal ever in my life for fear that, and I wouldn't be able to write any of the things down that were going through my head, because I was afraid that if somebody discovered them, they'd think I was really messed up. So the process of writing and putting things down in black and white in paper was so cathartic and therapeutic. Here I was for the first time committing things to paper, and I was laughing and I was crying at the same time, but it was just cathartic and therapeutic. And it's almost like once she said keep going, and she suggested I take all my answers that I'd emailed her in the previous emails to put them in some chronological order, to continue filling in the gaps and continue telling the story. And that's how it came about. So it is the story of my life, of growing up, moving to a new country, and trying to figure out who I was in that new country, but also trying to figure out who I was, whether male or female, and what the challenges were, and some of the things that I've talked about my being able to reconcile my.
We're about to go off the air live. The show will still be recording, so those that want to continue to listen to the end of the interview, you'll be able to hear the full interview on demand at Blog Talk Radio. Okay, continue, Lisa. I'm sorry, I had to say that every time before we're going to go off the air.
Okay, so yes, that's basically what the book is all about. It's just my biography up until the time that I had the surgery and the few months after that, because there is kind of that's sort of where the book ends.
Well, the link is available here on Blog Talk Little Sludge shows for anyone who's interested in purchasing the book. It's in Amazon. It's been a pleasure, Lisa. These 30 minutes go flying, and sometimes I put too many questions in one show, but it's just I want the listeners to get as much information about our guest as possible.
Thank you, Mark. It's also available. Hello?
Go ahead.
No, the book is available as Kindle and also on iTunes as an ebook, so which is always cheaper than the printed version.
Okay. So thank you very much for being on the show. We've totally enjoyed it, and the show will be on YouTube and it'll be on demand here at Blog Talk Radio. For those that didn't catch it live, they'll be able to catch it on demand later on. I want to thank you so much for your time, and appreciate you being on the show and for being who you are and helping others out there, because there are a lot of people out there that are struggling with beliefs and don't transition because they're afraid and they think that they are an abomination, and they're not. We're all beautiful in every way, and I believe we're here for a reason.
Yes, and we appreciate you coming out and telling your story as well. So,
well,
we'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Okay.
Have a
Bye-bye.
wonderful. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we wanted to point out. Hold on one second. She's on the recorded side. Okay, so we wanted to point out that due to such bigotry in various religious sectors, there have been many transgender as well as other members in the LGBTQ community who have been murdered due to the programming from these institutions.
Our message to the world is, if you are going to follow the words of mankind, make sure you distinguish between what Christ has said to what they interpreted. Christ was all about love without conditions, not about judging and segregating. Open up your hearts and your minds and realize we are God's children too. And now I'm going to end the show with a song that I wrote, if I can find the little cursor here, called Father Help Us. And this song was dedicated to Carlton Pearson, who was very much a great member of the evangelical community and was cast out because he got an epiphany that there was no such thing as hell, that the hell that there is here on earth. Again, the song is called Father Help Us, and it's one of my originals. Thank you, everyone, for joining us once again another night. Stay tuned for Thursday's show. We have Jillian from the T-Job Bank, and her last name is, let me get this again here, it's
Barfield.
Jillian Barfield. She'll be joining us on Thursday. Thank you, guys. We love you, but remember to always love yourselves too.
Have a great evening.
Inside your hand, your claims words are where you stand. Yet all I heard were reprimands. This loving man must take a stand to bring the truth upon this man. Father, help us, please explain that your son didn't die in vain, that there is no hell for us to face. Only hell is here on earth, that it won't get any worse, and they are damaging your words. only hell is here on earth, that it won't get any worse, and they are damaging your words. Father, help us. See the children of the world. What have they done to deserve this curse? How can they be so cruel and blind? These so-called Christians of our times, they're leaving everyone behind. Father, save us. Father, help us. Please explain that your son didn't die in vain, that there is no hell for us to face. The only hell is here on earth, that it won't get any worse, and they are damaging your words. Father, help us. They claim your kingdom for themselves, while sending all of us to hell. How can they be so filled with hate? Your words are clear, yet they dictate and keep on making the mistakes and separate us. Father, help us. Please explain that your son didn't die in vain, that there is no hell for us to face. The only hell is here on earth, that it won't get any worse, and they are damaging your words. Father, help us. You haven't spoken for a while. Yeah, most of us can hear you now. I feel your touch, your loving breath. You're telling me to tell the rest that heaven's waiting for us now. Father, help us. Father, help us. Please explain that your son didn't die in vain, that there is no hell for us to face. Oh, the only hell is here on earth, that it won't get any worse, and they are damaging your words. Father, help us, please. Oh, please. Help us from the one that claims to love you. Help us, Father. Father, help us, please explain that your son didn't die in vain,